about now? Much better, great. Hi everyone, Christina Bellantoni. I'm the editor-in-chief of Roll Call, on the job for a full 2 weeks and 1 day. But I actually returned to Roll Call. I had been there a few years ago, and I'm coming there from the PBS NewsHour, where I was the political editor and had worked with some of the people here on this panel and some of you. So thanks for joining us. Obviously, employment is a very important topic, and we have a very esteemed group of people to talk about it tonight, this afternoon, and we will be hearing from the congressmen and congresswomen as well. So I'll get right to it because I think we want to start our discussion right away. So let's see, I'll do this out of order here. We'll start. On the left, we have Phil Harvey, who is a professor of law and economics at Rutgers. Also has focused his policy research on securing economic and social human rights with a particular emphasis on the right to work. And we have Thea Lee, Deputy Chief of Staff at the AFL-CIO. You are in the President's office there. Dean Baker, many a time NewsHour guest, I will say, is the co-director and co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, frequently cited in economics reporting, author of many books, many columns, and glad to have you here. And John Cavanagh is the director of the Insitute for Policy Studies, and also an author of many books. So thanks, everybody, and we are waiting for Lawrence as well. So let's just start with the unemployment rate is going down or remaining steady. You have signs of growth in the economy, but people are still feeling as if they're not doing well. So what is the difference here, and how important is the number that so many Americans see for unemployment?
Sorry. I think it's important to realize, as I think most people know, the unemployment number that we hear every month, we'll get a new report a couple days, Friday, it's at best a very, very partial picture of the labor force. So what we're seeing is the unemployment rate's down a fair bit, actually, from its peak of 10% back in the fall of 2009. But most of the reason the unemployment rate's dropped hasn't been because people are finding work. Most of the reason it's dropped is actually that people have dropped out of the labor force. You're only counted as being unemployed if you say you've been looking for work and have been unable to find a job. Now, it's fine in some cases people drop out of the labor force because in some cases they do things like retire, and that's great. We want people to be able to retire. But it's unlikely that most of the people who dropped out of the labor force in the last 3 years just decided to retire. So for the most part, we're looking at a situation, and we have, many others have looked at this closely. You can control for ages. We're looking at a situation where most of the people who have dropped out of the labor force are prime age workers, people 25 to 55, who would in principle still like to be working, but simply don't see opportunities out there. And obviously this is devastating for them. And one of the points that I think is really important, I'm sure others will make this on the panel, when you have high rates of unemployment, it's not just an issue for the people who are unemployed or people who have dropped out of the labor force. The whole point is workers up and down the income ladder have much less bargaining power. So all the people who are working at the minimum wage, at low wages, they're in a situation because there's high unemployment, they're not able to share in the benefits of the economy's growth. So this is a big deal for the people who are unemployed, people who aren't counted because they drop out of the workforce, and for the tens of millions who actually are working but aren't able to share in the gains of growth because they have no bargaining power.
Thea, you're nodding there as well.
Yes, please. No, I think you're right to draw attention to the number 6.7% and what it doesn't tell you. There's a couple of things in addition to what Dean said, which of course I agree with, but one is that this is a recovery. We're more than 4 years into the economic recovery, and we still have unemployment at 6.7%, which could be a recession in other times. The second thing, of course, is that also hides the variation in unemployment rates between different demographic groups, particularly African Americans, who have an 11.9% unemployment rate, which is clearly in recession-type level, and 8.3% for Latinos. And another piece that is missing from the 6.7% is that there are still almost 4 million long-term unemployed workers this many years after the recovery. So it's, and those are folks who not only are their own lifetime trajectories of earnings going to be impacted, but in many cases what research has shown is that even their children will be impacted by their long-term unemployment. So 6.7% is just the tip of the iceberg, but we are in a situation where the labor market is extraordinarily weak, and we need our Congress and the President and the Federal Reserve to really focus like a laser beam on addressing that situation.
Phil Harvey.
There's another, is this on?
No, you have to poke it, yeah.
Okay. There's another statistic that I think it's important to look at in deciding what kind of policies are needed to respond to the unemployment problem and how long those policies need to be put in place. And that's the number of jobs, vacant jobs that are available. We've counted the number of non-working individuals who want jobs and are looking for work for decades. But it's only been in the past 14 years that we have regularly counted the number of vacant jobs that employers are seeking to fill. And what data about the so-called job vacancy rate shows is that there is a vast job shortage in the United States, as everyone assumed there would be during a recession, but also the data shows that even when the unemployment reaches the 4 to 5% range that many economists refer to as full employment, there still is a large job shortage in the economy. There are not enough jobs to go around. And that means that if we really do want to achieve full employment, if that's our goal, if we really do want to secure the right to employment, which is the objective that this particular panel was organized to focus on, that it's necessary to devise and pursue policies that are not only capable of getting us back to the 4 to 5% rate of unemployment that existed prior to the recession, but of bursting through the NAIRU and actually ensuring that we have as many jobs as there are job seekers, so that then we can, in fact, have full employment. Short of that, we're going to be in a situation in which unemployed workers are playing a game of musical chairs, and all of the efforts we make to help them find work are simply going to result in other people being unemployed, because there have to be enough jobs to provide work for everyone.
And we're definitely going to be discussing a lot of those policies here today. I want to welcome Lawrence Mishel.
Apologies for...
It happens around here, especially in rainy days. President of the Economic Policy Institute, and bring in John on this last question.
Yeah, thanks. No, just as a corollary to where Dean started and what the others have said, clearly some jobs are being created at this moment as we are supposedly coming out of a recession. And the flip side of it, I think the reason why Congress this year is so focused on the minimum wage is that the fastest growing job categories, the bulk of them, are very low paid jobs. They're in retail. I mean, if we come up with a phrase to kind of sum this up, and Dean has a new book called Getting Back to Full Employment with this great picture of Spralmart on it. But the new jobs are the jobs of the Walmart economy. They are in retail. They are in the restaurant business. They're in home health care. They tend to be jobs that pay very, very little, where you work, but you can't work in dignity. And I know it's Congressman Conyers who's, as Professor Harvey has put it, who has reminded us that in 1948, the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights says that there is a right to employment. But what they, Eleanor Roosevelt and others who put that together, meant is a right to dignified employment. And I think the big point here, as we look at unemployment and where the jobs are, is a lot of the new jobs do not allow people to live and work in dignity.
So as a journalist, one of the things when I talk to people all around the country about the economy, they often will say, why isn't Congress doing anything? Why isn't the president doing anything? So is that a misconception? Are they doing something? And what can really be done when you talk about the bigger structural problems that we've identified here today? And I'll start with Lawrence.
Well, what they've done is done damage at the federal level and compounded by even more damage at state and local level. So on the latter, the fact that during this recovery, state and local jobs have declined by 1.5 million, while you would have expected, given various indicators, they would have added 1.5 million, adds 3 million jobs to the job shortfall. The federal government, by austerity, meaning rapidly reducing the deficit at a time when we actually need to have a robust deficit to be able to generate demand for goods and services, has compounded the problem. It took, probably lost 1.5 million jobs last year alone for that. So I guess the first thing we want to do is first do no harm. But of course, I think everyone on this panel thinks that much more can be done, should be done in economic terms, in moral terms, in political terms. There's every reason to do a very robust program to not only create many more jobs, but to create better paid jobs. And I'll stop there. That's echoing John's point about, we need wages and jobs. When I talk to people and you say, let's create jobs, they want to know what kind of jobs. If you talk about wages, they want to know, well, we need jobs. So we need rising broad-based wage growth, and we need a lot more jobs, and they reinforce each other.
Thanks. And I just pile on there that Congress could be changing the conversation and raising awareness about this issue, and they haven't done that. Instead, they've become mired in this ridiculous conversation about how much to cut the budget deficit rather than how fast to create jobs. And so I just have three quick things that I think Congress could be doing. One is cancel the sequester, because as Larry Mishel said, the cuts to government spending have really slowed down the recovery and have prolonged this very painful period. The second thing is to extend unemployment insurance benefits to the 1.6 million people who have exhausted them. And the third thing is to fund infrastructure spending at a level that would be robust, that would create millions of jobs, would also update our infrastructure, both the surface transportation and the other kinds of infrastructure, whether it's energy efficient retrofits that would make our country more competitive, more efficient, and more dynamic for the future. So those are three quick things that Congress could and should do.
Well, the president obviously is somewhat constrained by, what he can get through Congress. I will say a couple things. I mean, one is, first off, I think he really has been negligent in his responsibility just to explain the basic situation to the country. And, I think it's a strange story, because I say this to people invariably, they look at me like I'm crazy. I go, look, the problem here is we don't have enough demand in the economy. That's what we need. We need enough demand. We need, and that means comes from, can come from consumption, come from investment. The Republicans say we want the job creators to create. Yeah, wonderful, that's good. But job creators don't create jobs because you tell them you love them. So it's not. There isn't a story where the private sector will just come up and create the demand, which is why the government has to do it. And President Obama has to explain that to people, and he never did. He backed away from that. He sort of did that when he announced his first stimulus just after he took office in January of 2009. And then as soon as the stimulus passed, he said, okay, now we're going to pivot and focus on deficit reduction. Frankly, that was nuts. He knew, his advisors all told him the stimulus was not large enough. We're in a much deeper hole than that. They knew that, yet he said we have to focus on deficit reduction. So the point here is we have to spend money, and President Obama has to say that. And this is a story where deficits are good. Rather than celebrating we got the deficit down, he should be mourning the fact you threw millions of people out of work. Are you happy about that? That's what he has to explain to people. In terms of what he actually has in his arsenal, one of the main causes of the hole in demand we have to fill is the trade deficit. And the big story there is you have an overvalued dollar. And the reason the dollar is overvalued is a matter of policy. Partly our policy, but primarily policy of many of our trading partners, China being the biggest and most obvious. But many other countries deliberately keep down the value of their currency so that they could have a trade surplus with the United States, meaning we have a trade deficit with them. He can negotiate on that. We have lots of things we can offer. Like saying we don't care if you enforce Microsoft's copyrights or Pfizer's patents. We want you to raise the value of your currency against the dollar. President Obama could do that. He's given no indication whatsoever that he is doing that. So I would say on the one hand, explaining to the country the nature of the problem would go a very long way in at least making some room for progress. And secondly, the trade deficit is an area where he can have a direct impact. And it doesn't seem, I'll just say I'm not in on those conversations, it doesn't seem he has pushed that.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, two more things that President Obama could do. One, a direct extension of what Dean just said is President Obama has made it a priority to negotiate new trade agreements of the bad model, the model that started 20 years ago with NAFTA, agreements that are full of protections for corporations and empty of protections for workers and the environment. So he is pushing for Trade Promotion Authority to take away the rights of Congress to amend trade agreements. The key thing he could do is back off. Don't use the office of the presidency to bully people into voting for trade promotion authority. If that doesn't pass and we don't get the new trade agreements, he can prevent bad. The other thing he can do is, he did one, I thought, very creative thing in his State of the Union, which was he took a step towards a $10.10 an hour minimum wage by doing what he can do as president, which is to mandate that for federal contracts, or set in motion a process whereby federal contractors have to increase the minimum wage to $10.10. He can use the bully pulpit to spread that. We will have increases in the minimum wage this year. The question is how much. And he can do that, and he can do one other thing. I mean, going back to what FDR did so brilliantly in the 30s, he also can help start addressing the top. People in this country are furious about the levels of inequality in this country. He could do the same thing with federal contractors. He could say no federal contractor can pay its CEO more than 20 times the lowest paid worker, and bring in the other side of this. A more equal nation will be a nation of better work and better full employment.
I think that progressive economists also bear some responsibility for our poor performance in responding to the Great Recession. We never get what we want. We want single payer, but we get the Affordable Care Act. We want a $2.5 trillion stimulus, but we get an $800 or $900 billion stimulus. But one of the things that experience should teach us is that we have to be flexible in developing strategies for addressing the problem that are tailored to the political circumstances in which they have to be pursued. In the 1973 to 75 recession, there was a problem of high inflation, and the response of progressives and others at the time was to develop an alternative strategy based on direct job creation, the CETA program, which was poorly designed and badly executed. They didn't learn from what the New Dealers could have taught them, but nonetheless, it illustrates the willingness to pursue an alternative strategy. Now, Congress did vote to spend $800 billion on the ARA over a couple of years. If that amount of money had been spent instead on the direct job creation program, the strategy the New Dealers promoted, the unemployment rate could have been reduced to 2% for 2 years. And Obama would have been able to go into the midterm elections with the unemployment rate at that level rather than 9%. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that would have happened. It wouldn't have happened. But another advantage of the strategy is that it can be implemented at the local level. It does not have to be implemented nationally the way a fiscal stimulus does. And therefore, it's more likely that in the political conflict that would arise from a debate over policy that included that option, that some experimentation along those lines would in fact be tried. And I think that the results of that kind of experimentation could build support for the idea in a way that would be very, very productive. So I think that the progressive economists have been too fixed in their certainty that they know exactly what needs to be done to respond to the recession, and unwilling to consider other options.
Yes and no, but let me just mention that I support the idea of a public service employment approach, and I think a lot of other people have. And we actually helped incubate one working with Congressman George Miller. Jan Schakowsky has a proposal. Congressman Ellison has had a proposal. They did emerge in early 2010. They weren't there in 2009. And I agree that it's mostly a perceived ideological constraint that they should have actually totally blown away, because government directly providing employment is actually cheaper, more efficient, more targeted. And one of the things it can do is also, it can go on even when we get to so-called full employment, because there will be many, many communities that will have still very high unemployment. As we know, there's disadvantaged communities that live in recession even in the best of times. And we should have instruments to be able to work on providing jobs in those communities. And so developing that kind of program would be very useful on many fronts.
So the term political realities has come up a few times, and beyond just the obvious split that the Senate is controlled by the Democrats and the House is controlled by the Republicans, you've got a midterm election year, and both parties are attempting to wrest control from the other. So where can there be consensus? I mean, one thing you hear from Republicans quite a bit is job training, and that's something obviously key to the legislation that we're talking about here. So what specifically could we do with job training to actually break through this partisan divide?
Well, I think job training is great. I mean, how would you not want to see people be more qualified, have more skills? But the reality is that has almost nothing to do with unemployment. So if we look at the data, and there's a great deal of research on this at this point, if we look at the data, you find no evidence whatsoever sort of any large-scale skills shortage. I mean, you always have these employers who are quoted in the paper or featured on the news saying, "Oh, I just can't find anyone who has the skills they need." And Thomas Friedman, I remember, wrote a column. He was in Chicago talking about this manufacturer who said, "Oh, I'd hire anyone with the right skills who came through the door." And Adam Davidson, who writes for both the Times and NPR, did a great follow-up. He got a hold of the guy, called him up and said, "How much do you pay?" And I think it was $14 an hour. Well, the guy was describing you need someone who has skills in computers and metallurgy, and you want to pay this person $14 an hour? The basic test, if there's a skills shortage, we should find areas of the labor market where there's rapidly rising wages. We simply don't see that in any significant segment of the labor market. And don't tell me about North Dakota, not big enough. So point here is, yes, training is great, give people more skills, but that's kind of playing, the Kim musical chairs that Phil was talking about earlier. We don't have enough jobs, and training won't deal with that. Now, I will mention something that does have some bipartisan support that I think can go further, and that's work sharing. Boehner is a supporter of work sharing, and there's actually a provision attached to the extension of the payroll tax cut back in 2011 that has the federal government picking up the cost of state work sharing programs. I think there's 26 or 27 states, including big ones like California and New York, that have work sharing attached to their unemployment insurance system. And the federal government will pick up the cost of that program through 2014. So that's something, if we could get employers, rather than laying people off, to shorten hours, and half of the reduction in hours is made up for by the government through the unemployment insurance system, that seems to me kind of a win-win. I mean, it's better not having people forced to work shorter hours, but it's got to be better doing that than having them laid off. So that's something that actually does have bipartisan support. It'd be great to see that extended further.
John?
Yeah, if I could. Just to remind you, the bill that Congressman Conyers is putting forward, which has this great, succinct title, the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Trading Act of 2014. In it, he has a training component, and he also has a direct jobs grant for the creation of jobs, going through the Department of Labor to large cities and to states. How could you make this bipartisan? And I want to mention just one interesting thing that a number of us, we've been working with Dean on this, are trying to get to, which is the big question that's raised whenever you come up with a program that will cost money, like a job creation program, even these training programs, is how are you going to pay for it? This bill that Congressman Conyers has put forward would pay for it with a Wall Street tax, taxing Wall Street speculation to pay for Main Street jobs. This sounds a bit far-fetched. I'll just remind you that Barack Obama, when he was running in 2008, said he was for it. He even raised it in the White House and was told by Larry Summers he couldn't do it. Larry Summers is no longer there. And in the meantime, 11 European countries are about to enact a financial transactions tax, including conservative governments. So this includes Germany and France and many other governments. Conservative governments have gotten this through, are getting this through in Europe because the situation is desperate. There's both high unemployment and they desperately need money, not just for jobs, but for other things. And it would only affect, this is a tax, tiny tax on the buying and selling of stocks largely and derivatives. It affects a very small group of people. There is a strong argument to be made that it is a very good way to finance the sorts of things we're talking about. And I think the moment, as of May, this will start to be implemented in Europe. We will see it working there. And I think it it can open up the conversation in the United States in a bipartisan way about how you actually pay for this.
Go ahead.
I wanted to put in another pitch for something else that could have bipartisan support or should have bipartisan support, always has had bipartisan support in the past, and that is infrastructure spending. And to me, that's the most obvious. I spoke about it earlier. It's the most obvious thing to do when you need jobs and you need infrastructure. And the Chamber of Commerce has stood with the AFL-CIO in asking for this, so this is a pro-business thing. It's something that Republicans and Democrats have always stood forward for together in the past. Right now, we have this obsessive focus on the budget deficit, and so a lot of Republicans have abandoned their traditional support for these infrastructure bills. But there will be a surface transportation bill coming up soon, and that's one area where I think people can show that we're pulling together and that we are addressing some of our national needs. And that's what I'd like to see as a first step towards job creation.
Well, I usually don't have too many bipartisan proposals, but I'll add one, put one on the table that I thought was the one that Thea was going to mention, which is to address currency manipulation. As Dean has said today, our trade problems drain us of jobs. One way of getting more demand for goods and services is to import less and export more. And one of the reasons that that doesn't happen is that there's currency manipulation in other nations. You could address that. You could generate millions of jobs and actually lower the deficit without spending any money. And it is bipartisan. If you look at where this has passed in the House, and I guess that was prior to the 2010 election in the House, but it was bipartisan. There's been bipartisan support in both Senate and the House. But whenever it comes up, there is basically some, I don't want to call it conspiracy, but there's a way to make sure the votes don't happen in both houses and the administration doesn't support it. So if anyone were really serious about dealing with that, we could get a lot of good manufacturing jobs and many other jobs in the country without spending a dime.
And what about the role of private industry? I mean, obviously there was this Congressional Budget Office scoring yesterday of the Affordable Care Act. You've got private businesses saying sometimes they're wary of what's happening in Washington and they're holding back from hiring. How can you break through that, whether that's politically or through legislation or even just in educating people?
I'll take
you
first
shot.
Dean. Yeah. We hear a lot of rhetoric from these businesses, which I don't think is borne out by their actions. I mean, one of the things we always learn in economics is we look at what people do, not what they say. And, you start with the one about hiring, because, we've all heard that, businesses are uncertain. They're worried about the Affordable Care Act and all these crazy regulations and taxes and this and that, and therefore they're not hiring. Okay, simple story. If that's true, we should be seeing longer hours. Where are we seeing the longer hours? I mean, the point is simple. They have increased demand. That's what they're telling us. They have increased demand for labor. If, Obama weren't scaring them all the time, they would go out and hire more workers, but he's scaring them so they don't do that. Well, then they must be working their workers longer hours. We don't see that. Okay, it's a very, very simple story. So, I think the reality is, yes, they're going to complain and say, this is the end of the world, Obamacare's, socialism or whatever. But the reality is, at the bottom line, they're going to look at demand, they're going to look at their profits, which are at record highs, and that's really what's going to cause them to start hiring. When they see more demand for workers, that's when they'll start hiring. And I think we just have to take, much of what they say with a grain or pound of salt.
Businesses don't invest because they have investment funds. There's too many ways to park it in ways that don't create jobs. They invest because they think they're going to sell product, and they think they're going to sell product because there are customers out there. And I just want to underscore what Dean said. It's just absolutely the case. There's no data that suggests otherwise. It's an increase in demand that will get businesses to hire workers. And unless we find out a way of providing them with customers, they're going to sit on their hands. And nothing we can do to make them feel good is going to change that behavioral pattern.
I could beat a horse, but I'll let you go on another question.
So, and we'll start with Thea on this one. What can the role of labor unions be here? Obviously, the labor movement has had its ebbs and flows in this country, and where does it stand now, and how involved can it be in helping this recovery?
Well, thanks for that question. And this is obviously something that is #1 priority for the AFL-CIO, for our unions, which is to get people back to work. And because until you get people back to work, as I think Dean said earlier, and John maybe said as well, you can't empower workers. Workers don't have the bargaining power because they can't ask for higher wages. They can't form a union if they don't have the confidence that they're in a decent and a healthy labor market. So I think we've been kind of pounding and pounding and pounding on the Hill and on the President for a long, long time about this issue, along with a lot of the people at this table, along with Larry and Dean and John and Phil, that trying to basically convince Congress to do the right thing, whether it's in their inclination or not. And, you know, at the end of the day, ultimately all we can do is to say, as you said earlier, this is an election year. And so, you know, we need to go back to our state federations and our central labor councils and our members and our affiliates and put pressure at the ballot box on those members of Congress who won't recognize this as a problem, who won't act, and who are continuing to push misguided austerity policies at a time when we need the opposite of that. So I think it's our job to raise this issue up. It's our job to take care of workers who have lost their jobs. It's our job to press the government to do the right thing here.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I also want to really applaud the creativity of the AFL-CIO, where Thea works in terms of thinking creatively about organizing workers around the country. As I mentioned, a lot of the fastest growing professions are ones which traditionally have not been as open to trade unions. Domestic workers, you know, nannies, caregivers, restaurant workers, home health care workers, and so on. Now, some of those do have unions, but in other areas, workers are coming together to form worker centers to fight for their rights. All of these groups together, from the AFL-CIO to these others, have made raising the minimum wage a top priority this year, which, as Dean explained, is a key job creation strategy, because if workers have much higher wages, they will purchase a lot more goods, they will stimulate the economy, and that will lead to more employment. This is, by the way, I think when we look back a year from now and say, what did we win that we talked about here? We are going to win in many cities and a number of states, and at the federal level sometime in the next 2 years, an increase in the minimum wage. And it will be because of a very coordinated fight between organized labor, the people I talked about, and it also will be bipartisan. I mean, back to the last question, there's a set of the business community that are organizing around a high road business model that includes increasing wages and having paid sick leave. And this polls well even among Republicans. It's the decency thing that people in this country, if you work hard, there is a general feeling around among much of the public that you should be paid enough to live in dignity. So that is one where labor and its allies will have big wins. And I think the key question for us is, how do you build on the momentum of those fights to demand for more of the agenda we've just been talking about?
But just to pick up on that for a moment, because a few months ago you said we will have an increase in the minimum wage this year, and then just now you said within the next 2 years. So you're thinking it's possible after the election.
No, so it just happened. We're sitting here in Metro D.C. It just happened. I mean, a historic thing. Prince George's County, Montgomery County, D.C. It is happening in many cities across the country. It is being put on the ballot in many states. And it's clear, I mean, I think that George Miller and Tom Harkin, who are leading the fight here in Congress, they think that if those fights go well, and if the polling plays out, that it is possible to even pass it this year before the election, certainly after the election.
A couple quick things on that. We should remember in 1996, the Gingrich Congress, where the Republicans controlled both houses, passed an increase in the minimum wage. The other thing, just getting back to John's point about state and local minimum wages, There have been a whole set of minimum wage hikes, some at the state level, some at the local level, with many state and local governments having minimum wages that are considerably higher than the national minimum wage. Many state, local governments also have paid sick days, a number of other benefits for workers, and it's really made a huge difference in a lot of people's lives. And I'll just refer you to a book that, I'm forgetting all the list of authors, Michael Reich, I believe, is the lead authors, are all my friends, that give accounts of a number of these cases. And, you know, again and again and again, the evidence is overwhelmingly positive in the sense that, yes, you're raising wages, but no, there's no evidence of the horror stories that businesses will all, you know, run away, they'll stop hiring, this and that. You simply don't find that.
I think this illustrates a general principle that organizing at the state and local level is actually a good way to organize at the federal level, because it's at that stage that you begin to build a momentum. One of the problems in attacking the problem of unemployment is that it's harder to devise policies that reduce the level of unemployment at the state and local level than it is, say, an increase in the minimum wage. And that, to beat the dead horse that I'm up here to beat, is another advantage of the direct job creation strategy, because unlike fiscal stimulus or reliance exclusively on fiscal stimulus, it's a strategy that can be implemented at the state and local without necessarily applying at every place.
We're going to open it up for questions in a moment, but I wanted to get a sense of this philosophical question. You know, can access to decent jobs really be a human right, you know, as this legislation sort of addresses?
Yes, yes, yes. And in fact, it was the New Dealers, over a year before Keynes's general theory was even published, who first articulated the principle and the strategy for doing that. The very same committee that proposed the establishment of the Social Security system, the unemployment insurance system, also proposed that American workers be provided with employment assurance. And indeed, if that initiative had been politically approached in the same way that the Social Security Act had been, we might today have OASDHIEA, with the EA standing for employment assurance, as a social insurance benefit that the government guarantees. How does it guarantee? By doing whatever it can to stimulate private sector employment, but at the end of the day, standing ready to provide jobs for any workers for whom jobs don't exist in the regular labor market. It's cheap, it's effective, and it can be done in a way that's non-inflationary.
But let me paint it into an even broader picture. I mean, there's what's a human right, and what comes with being a citizen is something, just like the right to vote, has expanded, and it expands through political struggle. So what is a right is about what you can take. And I think this is a story about the economy. I think it's really important that people understand that over the last 30 years, I think people do understand there was a massive redistribution of income, power, and wealth. And that's why most families did not really benefit much from the economic growth over that period. I can guarantee you over the next 30 years, there will be substantial growth of income and wealth. And what lays before us is whether we're going to have a political struggle and economic policies that assure that people have jobs, good jobs, and economic security at work and in retirement. And so it's only just a matter about what you can take.
What could be a more fundamental human right than employment? Because it is essential to almost everything else that people need in their lives. Given that most of us aren't born with a trust fund or a guarantee from the government, if you want to eat, if you want to feed your children, if you want education for your children, you want health care, all of those things come from having a good job. And I think the United Nations has recognized the economic and social rights that employment is absolutely essential. So I think this is a good place. Even within the United States, it's not really an outlandish idea. The Humphrey-Hawkins Act that was discussed before is part of U.S. law, where we have established as a goal of public policy full employment. But the problem is that we've let that lapse. We've ignored it. This is something that exists in our law, but then we have over time allowed inflation, fighting inflation, to become a more important role than creating employment.
Yeah, I would chime in there. I mean, we really have been, going way backwards. I mean, if you go back to the late 60s, we had the unemployment rate under 4% in 1968, 69, which, of course, the peak year of the minimum wage. I would say that actually is accidental, but not entirely. I mean, not accidental in the sense that it was politics that was driving both. But, the obsession with inflation, and I should point out, part of this story is that, we really do let much of this get away in the form of euphemisms. I remember back in the 1990s when Greenspan, the early part of the decade, when Greenspan was raising interest rates deliberately to slow the economy and keep people from getting jobs. I mean, that was what he was doing. I mean, that's putting an unpolite way of saying it, but that was what he was doing. And it was reported in the media that, we don't want the economy to overheat. And I'm sure the vast majority of people listening to it were thinking, well, yeah, we don't want the stew to overheat. No one understood that what he was doing was keeping people from getting work, and that was what he was doing. And, at the very least, we need to get some honest discussion of this.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. And just to add one more thing, I think there's a story that we all in this room need to be able to tell, and Congressman Conyers needs to be able to tell, which is, to the question, can we make decent employment a right again? It's to say, yes, because we know how to do it because we've done it before. And the story is simply the story of our country from 1933 about to 1975, when we went from one of the most unequal countries in the world with among the highest unemployment rates to one of the most equal, as Dean has said, with one of the lowest unemployment rates. How did we do it? It was, as Larry said, it was through a huge struggle, led at that time by a big, strong, unified labor movement, which said, one, this is wrong, convinced the majority of people that the state that we were in was wrong. It was easier in a Great Depression, but we're still in, many of us feel, a Great Recession now. And it was done through, remember, in the 50s, under a Republican president, Eisenhower, the top marginal tax rate was 91%. There was a consensus, through struggle, to tax the 1% and big corporations and use it to pay for massive job creation bills like the GI Bill of Rights. We did it. We can do it again. Clearly, we have new challenges. We're in a more global economy. We have the challenges of climate. But we can do it, and it will take, I will just mention one date here, April 28th. There will be a big coming together of people in the trade union movement and its allies to demand a $15 an hour minimum wage. It'll be a new set of allies that are fighting for power, but as Larry says, it's not going to come. It will be through a struggle of those forces against those who don't want to give in.
Okay, we'd love to hear from you. If you have a question, I don't know if there's a microphone out there, but raise your hand and do us a favor and tell us who you are.
Electoral politics are really important here, and if we don't do something to get nonpartisan redistricting committees in the states, then with Citizens United, I don't see how we're going to change the makeup of Congress and the dynamics.
This might be more my field than anybody else here, but
Go for it.
one thing you have seen at the state level, we've talked a little bit about states making changes, is that some states have changed the way that they do things. California being one of them, they had a commission that sort of redrew lines, and it was sort of a big old mess, but they've actually had some benefit out of that, I'd say, in the long term. But those structural political problems are certainly creating a lot of the gridlock here in Washington.
Maybe I'd just add, I thought this is what you were going to raise, but you didn't, was just the power of money in politics. So we have that issue, but I actually think the flood of money in politics has a corrosive effect overall and within both parties. I'm nonpartisan. I shoot at both parties. And there's a lot of problems within the Democratic Party. Of the importance of money and powerful business corporate interests being able to veto and shape policy, And you know, I think it's even more problematic on the other side. So, you know, that, as an economist, I can't say I can solve that. But Dean and I can solve, well, with Phil and everyone else, we can get you full employment if you give us the levers.
The votes in Congress.
Go ahead.
Before we get to a plague on both your houses, which is sort of the tone that I've seen from the panel, and saying it's Congress's fault, and Obama should do more, and all this. What about the fact that Obama did propose the American Jobs Act? CBO said that it was worth between 1 and 2 million jobs and a full point on the unemployment rate. In the past, well, even now, there would be the votes in both houses. It had a majority in the Senate, but it was blocked by filibuster. It had a majority in the House if they allowed it to come to vote, because all the Democrats would vote for it. There would be the 18 or 20 Republicans who need. What about that? And isn't there really just a blame on one side of this, because that kind of thing has been blocked and the votes would be there?
I'll take that. I'm going to be glad. So, yeah, I think there's ways to criticize both parties, but it doesn't mean that they're both equally culpable. You know, I would think the thing that derailed job creation more than anything else was deficit hawkery, which was a product of outside forces. It's a product of centrist Democrats as well as the Republicans, and that was what derailed the early good work of the initial stimulus that needed to be built on. I'll just I go even further. The House of Representatives on December 17th, 2009 passed the second stimulus, but never got voted on in the Senate. So it's not just, you know, the president proposed the American Jobs Act way after that. So there's a lot of people, a lot of heroes, as I mentioned, you know, trying to do things. Most of the people trying to do things were within the Democratic Party. I was only just pointing out that there's struggles within the party as well as between the parties.
You here?
Phil Marks from Representative Dan Kildee. So you mentioned infrastructure investment. I'm interested in hearing your perspective on short versus long-term job creation. I know there's a lot of debate recently with the Keystone Pipeline.
You know, one of the things that was just amazing to me when we had the first stimulus, there was this obsession with shovel-ready projects. And on the one hand, it was good to try to get people employed quickly, but the idea that we had to do things quickly or not at all was close to crazy. And I think it really derailed a lot of longer-term projects that, I mean, people were worried if we didn't somehow spend the money in 2009, 2010, that we wouldn't need it. And of course, here we are, you know, 4 years later, we see we still very much need it. So, I mean, I think it makes sense to talk about longer-term projects. Where are we going to be? If you mention the Keystone Pipeline, there's very few jobs at stake there. That just doesn't make sense as a jobs issue. That's a question, you know, we'll get somewhat cheaper oil from Canada, huge environmental cost, you know, how do you balance that? For me, that's kind of a no-brainer. Why would we do it? But the jobs, you know, the number of jobs there, you know, in normal economy, we produce those jobs in a day, you know, so it's not, there aren't a lot of jobs at stake in the building of the pipeline.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that. I remember, I think President Obama, candidate Obama, before he was president, made some great speeches about a transformative economic agenda that would include a whole new infrastructure, in essence, shifting us from the old fossil fuel economy to a new energy, clean energy, energy efficiency economy. And it was interesting, in those early days of the stimulus debate, it was at a time when the Obama people were inviting really a big spectrum into the White House. And I remember going into a number of these meetings, and they had just hired Van Jones at the time. This is really going back to ancient history, to be the green jobs guy. And I remember just watching these, they were moving so fast, and they brought in people from the private sector to be in each of the executive branches of government. And, you know, transportation department gets $30 billion in stimulus and so on. And this obsession with shovel ready meant that much of the money went into the old infrastructure. And I know we got to rebuild the old infrastructure and the bridges and so on, but they didn't allow themselves the moment to pause and say that much money could have jump-started a real transformation of this country into the post-fossil fuel era. Good for the planet, good for workers, good for everybody. And that still remains our big challenge.
Put this in a broader context, I think. We are about to face, over the next 10 years, a decline of public investment, including infrastructure, of about a third. That's what's in the pipeline. Because the domestic discretionary budget, we're on the Capitol Hill, we can use such terms, right? Is going to decline to around 2.2% of GDP from where it was 3.4%. That's even under an Obama budget. That means public investment, which represents half of that, is going to decline remarkably. I think the American people would support a massive public investment program. I don't think they actually want something that's going to be, I think the polls would show, they don't want something that's going to be just a little bit for a year or two. I don't think they mistakenly don't believe that would help. I think it would help. But I think what we need is a really large-scale program. And I'll just couple that with, in the near-term years, it should be deficit finance. But over the longer term, it can be financed with things like a financial transaction tax. I mean, we just had yesterday the release of the CBO report about future deficits. All the deficits over the next 10 years. Most of the deficits are because we had the Great Recession caused by the banks. Okay? So we have debt, we accumulated debt because of them, so let's levy a tax on them, let them finance the public investment program going forward.
Congresswoman Wilson is here and just has a couple remarks. Thanks for helping to organize this event.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Christine, for moderating for us today, and thanks to the panel of experts. It's certainly a pleasure. We were voting, and I'm sure my staff has a plethora of information that they're going to share with me as we discuss what has happened. Thanks to all of you for coming. This is a wonderful turnout, and we certainly appreciate it. This helps us understand that our number one issue in this country, in this nation, is jobs, jobs, jobs. Because there are now nearly 30 million Americans either unemployed or underemployed. I think we have a moral crisis, and I think it's our obligation to solve this crisis. We founded the Jobs Caucus to hear what works. It's hard to imagine a better panel of experts than the one that you have heard today. In my own experience, I've seen what works in educating children to enter the job market and succeed. I founded the 5,000 Role Models of Excellence project and mentoring program in Miami 20 years ago to give young people the chance to succeed in college and their careers. But if there is a critical shortage of available jobs, our economy will stagnate and no one will succeed. Achieving full employment isn't only about helping jobless people. When we return to full employment, investors and business people have more customers. When we return to full employment, workers have power to bargain for higher wages. When we return to full employment, crime declines as desperate people gain a paycheck and a purpose. When we return to full employment, we can not only end poverty, but also reduce our deficits and debt. It's time to prepare, it's time to restore dignity for the tens of millions of Americans who have suffered the physical and emotional pain of joblessness. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's my wonderful pleasure to be sharing this podium with our Dean, John Conyers. I just love him and admire him in all that he's done, and I'm walking in his footsteps and trying to be just like him. Thank you so much.
The check is in the mail.
You win for the best hat. You win for the best hat.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Let's give a round of applause to this distinguished panel. Aren't they great? What a pleasure to see all of you here. Let's come to a little bit of agreement on this. The importance of full employment in our economy at this stage of our existence has got to be the #1 domestic objective of this Congress and of the private sector as well. We want full employment to be given emphasis and understanding, and that's what we're doing here today, teaching everyone to understand that a job is required not just psychologically, but for everybody that wants to provide for himself or for his family. Now, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and someone's going to remind us of this in more detail, who determined back in 1944, State of the Union Address, at full employment, jobs are a human right. It's more than even just earning a wage to exist. It's a human right. And he encapsulated that very well. And so we come up now with the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act with 57 co-sponsors, H.R. 1000, and we created for the first time a full employment caucus. So we have a caucus now created and we have 19 members of Congress in that caucus. We want to set up a couple trust funds for creating the jobs and training people to be able to get the jobs. And so I'm happy that Bob Sisler is here. That is Bob Sisler back there, isn't it? From Detroit. He comes to Washington. He goes to New York. This has been a very important issue for him, and I'm so glad to see him here, as well as all of you. Thank you very much. Let's get it on with.
Thank you so much, Congressman Conyers. Let's take one more question, and then we'll wrap up for the day. In the back.
The last speaker, Mishel, mentioned that the recession was caused by Wall Street shenanigans, for lack of a better word. So my question to the panel is, what role should Wall Street play to increase and create full employment, and in what ways is it trying to stop it?
Well, I'll just take a quick shot at that. I mean, Larry was talking about the idea of a small financial transactions tax. You know, basically, I see sort of this two separate roles that the financial sector plays. One is the one that we want them to play. We look to the financial sector to borrow money for a house, start a business, send our kids through school. I mean, that's what it's supposed to do. On the other hand, you have the financial sector engaged in gambling. And that is its main activity today. That is how you get hugely rich on Wall Street. Most of the people who are walking around with hundreds of millions or billions on Wall Street didn't get there by, making loans to businesses to grow. They got there by speculating. And we have to make that difficult. I mean, I don't know if we could outlaw it. I mean, I don't know how you would outlaw that, but certainly you could tax it. I always like to make the comparison to gambling. You gamble in Atlantic City or Las Vegas, we tax you very heavily, or the lotteries. You pay a tax at 25–30%. I don't mean on your winnings, I mean on your playing. So you talk about a modest tax on speculation. That seems to me a straight out win, and hopefully we can get them more focused. I mean, I would, my longer prescription list I can give you, but not here, we will get them more focused on doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is supporting the productive economy, because by itself, they're not productive. They're an intermediate good. I always say it's like trucking. Suppose our trucking sector had quintupled relative to the size of the economy. Any economist would go, you have an incredibly inefficient trucking sector. And that's the case of finance, and that's how we have to think about it.
Yeah, if I could first, I know we will all be here in this room a year from now celebrating the 50th year that Congressman John Conyers is in this Congress. We applaud his leadership, and I'll just say, Congressman Conyers, before you came in, several of us were touting the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment and Training Act, including for the reason that it is financed by a Wall Street tax that we all think is both doable and would be very popular. The one other thing I'll just say about Wall Street, and this is in a bipartisan reign, if you look at the interesting bills to transform Wall Street from the casino that Dean just described into a financial sector that works for Main Street America and Main Street jobs, there's a couple of bipartisan bills there. Senator Brown and Senator Vitter have a bill that would cut back, that would create huge disincentives for the 4 giant banks. It would cut them back. And Senator Warren and Senator McCain have a bill that would reintroduce the Glass-Steagall Act. Both of these, I think, become interesting when the next Wall Street collapse starts, or when Wall Street is in trouble, and where you will have both the broad range of progressives and decent people in this country who want to do something, and a lot of people on the right who are very suspicious as well of what Wall Street has become, coming together, and you could get some real reform. I think we need to be ready for that moment.
On that optimistic note, I will say thanks to everyone very much for being here, and thank you so much to our esteemed panel, John Cavanagh, Dean Baker, Thea Lee, Philip Harvey, and Lawrence Mishel. Thanks again for being here, and have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you. Hello.
How are you? Good to see you down here.
Yeah. You know, it was your economist in your outfit that...
I know we were engaging about your piece a long time ago about some of the employment estimates.
And
did we help her?
It didn't help. Delayed publication for 6 months with no substantial change in the piece. But what bothers me is that while there was private criticism, with me back and forth, it wasn't like it was secret. No willingness to engage in a public debate.
Oh. You want us to engage in public debate about your employment estimates?
About the direct job creation strategy. Say publicly what has been said to me repeatedly, which it is no different than spending money on infrastructure investment, for example.
We've been for plenty of public service employment programs.
As a job training...
No, not job training.
And
I don't give a shit about job training.
No. Job training in the sense that CETA was, CETA 2 was.
No.
Job training and job creation for disadvantaged workers, not as a strategy to expand.
Did you see George Miller's bill?
Yes, I saw George Miller's bill.
Jan Schakowsky's bill, or
I helped with Jan Schakowsky's bill.
Yeah, but those are not about just disadvantaged workers. No, I don't think you had to be disadvantaged to get a job in those things. It's for public. I don't actually buy that kind of approach.
I think you're not.
So I think we're not at cross purposes.
Well, wait, look.
In terms of the policy.
My argument is, in a nutshell, that you can create 2 to 4 times as many jobs if you spend it this way rather than the other way.
I agree.
But
I don't know about those specific numbers.
Whatever the numbers are. Well, wait.
I haven't worked. I just said without endorsing. I don't know.
Well, but